Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Izuku got Cthulhu Quirk, part 1. I don't own this fanfic, and also make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, ZGW, and support him for writing this awesome fanfic, link is in the description. Let's begin the story. Izuku Midoriya stared down at his notebook as it floated in the water, charred black in places, and was getting nibbled on by koi fish. Hero analysis for the future number 13 was written across the front in black marker. Alright, that's enough. He muttered as he picked his notebook up out of the water, the fish scattering and swimming away. Damn it, he swore as he flipped through the soaked and charred pages. Thankfully most of the information inside was intact, so he wouldn't need to spend much time rewriting it all. Keeping his head down, he started his walk home, the sun shining in the bright blue sky and the wind brushing gently through the trees. It was a beautiful day, marred in the reminder that Izuku's dream was unobtainable due to a matter of birth. He had no quirk, no special power or ability that 80% of people nowadays had. He had nothing to make him stand out except the absence of anything special. He thought that he was ordinary at best, compared to people whose quirks were honestly no big deal and undesirable at worst. But Izuku was wrong. It was far more terrible that the man following behind him found him desirable in his quirklessness. The man made sure to keep far behind Izuku, walking slowly and looking down at his phone to appear uninterested in his surroundings. But every so often his eyes would flick up and stare at the back of Izuku's head, burrowing past his green hair into his skull. So much hardship, all due to a cruel twist of fate. The man thought, tearing his eyes away, the color fading from a twisting and sickly green into a natural deep brown. But that will be over soon. He sped up his walking and put his phone away. He then began to mutter words that stilled the air as soon as they left his mouth, and from the same pocket he put his phone and pulled out a syringe filled with a clear liquid. Izuku walked on, unaware of all of this until he noticed that his legs began to drag, as if weighed down by something. What? He thought, as he tried to take another step forward only for his foot to get an inch off the ground and then freeze there. What's happening? He panicked as he tried to turn his head only to find it also locked in place. A quick attempt to move any part of his body revealed that he was completely frozen in place. Even his eyes were locked in place, staring at his feet and shadow. Ah, cannot work yug verga cannot work yug verga cannot work yug. A man's voice came up from behind him and Izuku saw a shadow come up from behind his right side. It walked around to his front and stopped there. Verga yug. Hello, Izuku-kun. The man said as he finished droning the words that felt wrong to Izuku somehow, making his paralyzed skin crawl. The shadow's hands moved and a long thin piece of plastic fell at his feet. Now don't worry, none. The man said as he moved forward, sharp pain erupted in Izuku's neck. I'm going to introduce you to someone who loves quirkless people like us. Izuku's vision began to swim and the shadows on the ground twisted into mocking shapes as he lost consciousness standing up. The hunter stared up at the hound turning slowly in the air, the noose tied around his neck. He tore his eyes away from the dead man and looked down at the folded paper below his hanging feet next to the kicked-over stool. Bending to pick it up he unfolded it and read the two sentences. I'm sorry, the truth is too much. Too much for you, you mean? The hunter thinks as he tore the note to tiny shreds as he stood back up and glared at the corpse. 5 months in and you have already retired. He didn't spend long searching the hound's apartment, not wanting to be around when the kicked-in door drew attention. But he quickly found the dead man's pistol, stash of ammunition, and journal. The pistol and ammo he pockets and wastes no time ripping out some pages, stuffing them into a wastebasket and then using his lighter to burn all of it. Now with a fire burning on top of the kicked-in door he fled the apartment, not looking back as he walked down the stairs and out onto the streets. Not stopping he walked down the deserted city street, the sun slowly setting and turning the sky orange against the steel skyscrapers. Once he was far enough away he pulled out his cell phone and called one of the few numbers in his contacts. The hound retired. He said when his call was answered. Any changes? Word just came in about a missing boy who has been gone since yesterday afternoon. The entertainer answered, her tone apparently unsurprised or uncaring about the hound. Same as the others, he's between the ages of 13 to 16 and quirkless. If he's a virgin then that's 3 for 3. The hunter continues as he reaches the car he uses for these things, parked in the street. When's the ritual time again? He asks as he opens it and sits behind the driver's wheel. He opens the glove compartment, throwing the hound's pistol inside and slams it shut. Sunrise after a night with a waxing gibbous moon. The entertainer answered. Last night was the first quarter moon so you got until morning. You got a lead. I got several. He answers as he leans back to look into the back seat of his car where a duffel bag sits. He pulls it towards him with his free hand and unzips it to look at the shotgun, the many shells he took with him, and the large hunting knife inside. Can you handle it by yourself? The entertainer asked, an actual touch of concern in her tone. The robber can be there in no. He snapped, zipping the duffel bag shut. I'm good. I'll call you when the job is done or it's too late. He hung up before she could answer and tossed his phone into the front passenger's seat. Taking a moment to sigh, he pulls out a pack of cigarettes and lights one, rolling down the window to blow the smoke outside. Alright, he thinks, pulling out a notepad out of his pocket, first one. He flips open the notepad and looks at the 5 addresses listed on it, all of them scattered across the city. Finding the nearest one, the hunter flips it closed, buckles his seatbelt, starts the car, and pulls into the street to start his side job. Friday, April 9, 2128. Izuku woke up once again looking at the ground, although this time he was not standing, but kneeling with his head down. Where am I? He thought as he came to, his vision swimming back into place. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkness, but when they did he found his blood going cold. There were chains hooked to cuffs on his hands, ankles, and neck keeping him in place on the concrete floor. The quick jerk of his legs proved that he couldn't even begin to rise up, and he fell back on his knees. Oh God. He whispered in a panic as he swung his head around at his surroundings. He was alone thankfully, but that was all he could be thankful for. Izuku was in what looked like a small basement, lit only by a single hanging light bulb. It was empty except for stairs leading up to presumably the rest of the house, a ring of unlit candles around Izuku, and a large hole in the wall in front of him, big enough for him to easily crawl into, that led to pitch blackness. Okay. Remain calm. He thought quickly, shaking his chains to try and get the cuffs off of him. Gotta be calm. Can't freak out. He tried to take some deep calming breaths. Okay, I'm physically fine. He began to mutter as he moved his body to see if anything hurt, and aside from some aches from being in this position for long, nothing did. I'm still dressed in my uniform, even my shoes are still on. Was I kidnapped by a villain? Izuku muttered as he tried to figure out why this had all happened. I remember freezing in place. Was it a paralysis or petrification quirk? But his memory strained as he tried to remember what his shadowy kidnapper had said. He said that he was going to introduce me to someone who loves quirkless people like us. I've never heard of a quirkless villain before. Just like there were no quirkless heroes, his mind felt the need to remind him of. How did he hold me in place to drug me if he had no quirk? Izuku remembered the sharp pain in his neck that preceded his unconsciousness. How did he know my name? Has he been stalking me? The empty basement offered no answers, and so he continued to kneel there, trying to figure out what had happened. If he did have a quirk, how would it have worked? He muttered, having a new problem to take his mind off of his inability to escape his shackles. The easiest answer is that it works just by looking at someone with continued focus, maintaining the effect. But I didn't freeze instantly, I slowed down a bit before it took effect. Maybe it needs a few seconds before working. He continued to mutter as he shifted uncomfortably. And what were those words he was saying? The memory of the words caused goosebumps, the way that they felt wrong to his ears, and the air got stiller as the man saying them got closer and closer. Burkini, he tried to pronounce the words he had heard, a shiver running up his back when he got the first one right, and the air coming from his mouth starting to still when he made the second. It's Yug, with a pause between and. A familiar voice behind Izuku spoke, and the boy whipped around, as much as the chain allowed, to look at his kidnapper. He was a man probably in his mid-20s with short brown hair and brown eyes, wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and socks. He smiled down at the teenage boy chained to his floor. Good almost morning, Izuku-kun. Be please, Izuku began to blubber as the man walked around the unlit candles, his hands in his pockets. I won't tell anybody about this. Just please let me go. Oh, we both know that won't happen. The man said as he pulled a book of matches from his pocket and pulled one out. Just like it didn't with the other 3. He smiled as he struck a match and kneeled down to light the first candle. I was a lot like you, Izuku-kun. He said as he moved to the next candle. Wanting so desperately to be a hero, to just have a quirk really so I can fit with everyone else. Although he chuckled as he moved onto the third candle, the bullying was not as bad as yours. Have you been stalking me? Izuku whispered as he shrank away from the man and continued to circle him and light the candles. No, I saw you for the first time today when you walked home from school. But, he smiled and looked Izuku in the eyes. I got a gift. His eyes shifted from brown to a sickly green and then back again just as fast. You said that you didn't have a quirk. Izuku shouted, the man is now halfway done lighting the candles. And I don't, it's a gift. The man answered calmly. From my master, who, he lit the last candle and then backed away from the circle, will be here shortly. He then walked back up the stairs to the light switch and flicked it off, plunging the room into the soft orange glow of the candles around Izuku. The man then walked back down the stairs and stood behind Izuku outside of the circle. You can look forward or keep your eyes closed, it makes no difference to him. Before Izuku could ask what the man was talking about, he began to do something between a chant and a drone. He made a horrible noise that made Izuku's teeth itch and his skin crawl like never before. He would have cried out and begged the man to stop if the candlelights hadn't changed color. The flames flickered from yellow to green for a few moments before all shifting over to green permanently, and the smoke rising up from them increased and swayed in the air around the circle. Izuku was speechless as he watched this, the smoke trails beginning to join and flow together to make a spinning ring above the circle of candles. And deep within the hole in the wall, in the pitch-black tunnel far beyond the candlelight, over the droning chant of the man came a rumble. It was a growl that was low, dark, and sounded very hungry. The hunter pulled his car in front of the shitty one-story house in one of the worst neighborhoods in the city. He flipped open his notebook, crossed out the fourth address on the list, and then flipped it closed again. He leaned back in his seat and sighed, the early morning light starting to come up in the east. Last chance. The hunter thought. If this isn't it, we'll have to wait until he takes another kid. At least we'll have his address by that point. Opening his eyes, he unbuckled his seatbelt and reached into the backseat for the duffel bag. Unzipping it, he pulled out the shotgun for the fourth time that night, the hound's pistol in one of his pockets and the hunting knife strapped to his leg. Quickly eyeing the street to make sure that the coast was clear, he opened the car door and rushed to the house's front door, shotgun clutched firmly in both hands. Crossing the lawn quickly, he paused at the front door and pointed the shotgun at the lock, firing twice before backing off to kick the door open. He brought the shotgun against his shoulder and proceeded inside the small house, carefully checking the living room on his right and the kitchen attached to it before proceeding down the hall. Both rooms were empty, but the hunter felt a familiar tingle on his skin. Magic was in the air. This was the place. He had to hurry. The hallway only had 2 doors, and the one on the end was an empty bedroom with a bathroom attached. The closed one in the middle, however, was a laundry room with another door. The feeling of magic got stronger as he approached, and he knew he had the room. Breathing deeply, he flung the door open and charged down the steps, shotgun at the ready. The room was dark, but he saw a teenage boy chained to the floor in a circle of green flamed candles and circling smoke before a large hole in the wall. The boy was wearing a middle schooler's uniform and looked like he had green hair and eyes and looked like he was about ready to shit himself as he twisted himself to look at the hunter. Under the stairs. The kid cried out. He's on getting his warning and hearing the lunge from behind him. As he reaches the bottom of the stairs, the hunter swung around in time to smash the butt of the shotgun against the man's face. The man went sprawling against the stairs and was about to get up before the hunter brought the muzzle of the shotgun against his forehead. The man tried to speak before the hunter pulled the trigger and splattered half of the man's head all over the stairs and basement floor. As the body did a final twitch and the kid vomited at the sight of all the brains and blood, he took a deep breath and let the adrenaline that had briefly come up exit his system. Looking over at the kid, who was still puking his guts out onto his pants, he walked back up the stairs to hit the light switch and turn the single light back on. Should have hit that on the way down. He thought to himself. Getting sloppy. He made his way back down and walked up to the kid, who was done vomiting and was now just spitting up what was left in his mouth. "Thank you, mister," the kid said as he looked up at the hunter reloading his shotgun with the shells he brought in his pocket. "Are you with the police or white kid?" he said as he looked at the hole in the wall. The room was silent for a moment before a growl reverberated out of the hole. It was a familiar one to the hunter. He hummed as he walked over the left side of the hole and leaned against it. "Wait, what are you doing? Can't you hear that? We gotta get out of here," the kid shouted as another growl came out of the hole, this one much louder and closer. "I said shut up. Just sit there and be good bait," the hunter said. Before the kid could say another word, the hunter softly spoke the words. "KKXXXHJGT." There was a shift in the air, and before the kid's very eyes the hunter disappeared into thin air. Izuku wanted to shout at the man that had saved his life about what he meant by bait, but to his astonishment, he had vanished before his very eyes. A man in his mid-40s with brown eyes and short black hair, dressed in plain brown pants, white button-down shirt and boots with a shotgun, had blinked out of existence in front of him. And he had done it after uttering 3 of those strange words that sounded so similar to the ones that the man, currently cooling on his basement stairs, had used. He knew they were the same because they made his skin crawl the exact same way. Another growl came out of the hole, and Izuku tensed up as he tore his eyes from where the man had been and focused them onto the pitch darkness before him. He gulped and felt his heartbeat faster as soft new sound reached his ears, a thump, followed by a dragging sound. The sound came closer and closer to the hole, and Izuku began to struggle against his chains again before whatever was coming towards him appeared. He failed and was treated with a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The thing that crawled out the darkness was barely able to move around in the tunnel, making do by clawing its way forward with the 2 thin pale purple arms that came out of its wide mouth. Every time it would slam an impossibly wide six-fingered hand into the ground, it would make a thump sound, and then when both were securely in place, it would pull itself forward, creating the dragging sound. This Izuku saw and understood in the few seconds that he saw the head of the creature before it pulled itself out into the open basement. Its skin was a pale white that secreted some sort of slime that made the dirt of the tunnel fall right off. It had no eyes or nose that he could see, but he assumed that the small holes behind its mouth served as ears. The mouth of the creature was round and always open, expanding and contracting, but never fully closing, as it breathed deeply. At its widest he could see rows and rows of sharp yellow teeth that traveled down the inside of its long body, which was now a good 6 feet out of the hole and not stopping and looked like it could swallow him whole. The arms also seemingly traveled all the way down the creature's insides, no end in sight. For a brief moment when the creature opened its mouth wider than the other times he saw deep into the creature. For only a split second he saw bones resting in this creature's seemingly endless throat, a skull staring back at him, and a middle school uniform similar to his own damp with blood and saliva. As the creature reared up somehow to tower above him at 8 feet tall, and another 6 leading to the hole, and still not out all the way, Izuku nearly pissed himself as he began to shake and tears formed in his eyes. Forgetting about the disappeared man, there was just him and this creature now, something that he could have never imagined existing in this world. Even with all the quirks and amazing things that had become normal. The arms extended out of the mouth, every couple of feet a new elbow-like joint would appear that allowed them to bend in multiple directions and lowered to Izuku. The boy made no sound as the wide 6-fingered hands, which he just noticed looked too human, grabbed his sides and started to lower its wide open mouth down towards him. Together the hands completely surrounded his body. No. 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 He screamed, tears streaming down his face as he struggled against the death coming slowly descending upon him. The man with the shotgun reappeared in a blink, his shotgun pointed at the creature's head. With a shot that nearly deafened Izuku, he blew a fist-sized hole into and out of it. The creature let go of Izuku and reared back, releasing a screech that finished what the shotgun blast started and left the boy's hearing dulled. Raising his shotgun, the man fired again, punching another hole in the creature's midsection. Purple blood poured out these wounds and fell onto the concrete floor and all over Izuku, who hardly noticed. Before the man could get another shot off, the creature smacked him aside with its wide hands. The man went flying into the basement wall, and before he could get up, the creature's hands held him down as it began to retreat back into the hole. As the creature retreated, it allowed its arms to extend out of its mouth, replacing the space lost by the body with the thin pale purple arms. Hack hack. The man said as the hands began to crush him and he once again blinked out of existence. The hands of the creature continued to press down onto thin air for a few seconds before they suddenly fell to the concrete floor. The hand searched around for the man and the creature stopped retreating back into the hole. Seemingly confused, the creature moved its head to look where the man had been. Only for the man to reappear in a blink with his shotgun's muzzle nearly pressed against the creature's left ear hole. He fired again and punched another hole through the creature that sent it thrashing around. This time the creature didn't have enough time to bring its now impractically long arms around to attack him, so the man was able to get 3 more shots in before the creature stopped screeching and stilled. Its purple blood began to pool out from under its body, and a few seconds later the candles returned to their normal yellow light. What Izuku managed to stammer as he looked at the body of the monster in front of him was that. I don't know. The man with the shotgun answered as he pulled the knife that was strapped to his leg out and plunged it into the creature's body. It gave no reaction, so it was assuredly dead. Don't need to know the name of something to know how to kill it. Oh. Izuku whispered as the man pulled out his knife and wiped the purple blood on the dead body. Thank you, again. He said as his body continued to shake in fear despite the danger having seemingly passed. I wouldn't have died without you. Yeah. The man said as he loaded a new shell into his shotgun, the weapon having been emptied into the monster. Don't be doing that. He said as he brought the shotgun to his shoulder again and pointed it at Izuku. Why? Izuku whispered as his body stilled, staring up the barrel of the weapon to the man aiming down it. Saw too many kids. The man said simply with a shrug. Got a message for your folks. I'll try to pass it on. Before Izuku could speak, a new shadow appeared in the room and the man's eyes flicked to the top of the stairs. He tried to raise his shotgun only for some metallic object to fly over Izuku's head and strike his hands. The man cried out as the shadow from the top of the stairs leaped into the room and rushed him, delivering a fast and devastating series of kicks and punches. Motherfucker. The man shouted as his shotgun was knocked out of his hands and he was brought to the ground face first, his arm twisted behind his back. Don't worry, young man. The shadow said as it solidified into a person, a man in a dark blue skin-tight suit with white trim. You're safe now. Because the hero started to give his introduction before he noticed the corpse of the creature coming out of the hole in the wall. What the fuck is that thing? Izuku's hands shook badly as he tried to bring the paper cup filled with water to his lips. It seemed that the closer his hands got to his mouth the more they wouldn't still, as images of what he had seen played out in his mind. He sat at a table in an interrogation room in some police station, having been brought there after the paramedics made sure that there were no apparent injuries on him. Why has no one come to talk to me yet? He wondered. The hero that had rescued him, Darkfighter, a D-lister who just got a pretty big fan, hadn't really listened to his babbling after he freed him and had focused on the man with the shotgun. That didn't get Darkfighter anywhere. When the police arrived he was told that he'd be making his statement at the station with the proper authorities and then he was handed off to the paramedics and then pushed into a patrol car. I have to get home, Mom will be worried about me. He thought dully as he looked at the clock and realized that it had passed 9. He had been sitting in this room for over 4 hours, trapped in his own thoughts and replaying the few minutes of terror over and over again. He was about to try rising up out of his seat when the door opened and 2 nearly identical men entered. Mr. Midoriya, we apologize for the wait, said the man in the black suit and tie on the right. Yes, traffic was deplorable. Villains you see, said the almost identical man in the black suit and tie on the left. Both of them had shaved heads and wore large sunglasses that completely covered their eyes. And they had matching smiles as they sat down in front of him and placed their briefcases on the table. We are federal agents from the government, Mr. Midoriya, said Right as he opened his briefcase. It is imperative that you tell us everything you saw this morning, said Left as his briefcase remained closed. Shouldn't I start from the beginning? When I got kidnapped yesterday. Izuku was confused. In all the shows and stories they always ask people to start at the beginning to get the events in order. Yes of course. Right said and his smile dipped a little. From the beginning, tell us of your capture. Left said, his smile not changing and breaking the identicalness with his partner. I was walking home from school. I took the same route that I always do. But this time, before I reached the tunnel, I just stopped. Izuku began to retell his experience from over half a day ago. I just stayed in place, mid-step. And then a man came up from behind me, saying some words. He shuddered as he remembered. Don't worry about the details, Mr. Midoriya. Right waved. Yes, just tell us what happened. A dead man's words are of little value. Left agreed. Okay. Izuku said, unsure about what was happening. Why wouldn't they want to know what the man that had kidnapped him had said? When he came up to me he injected me with something and I blacked out. Then I woke up in his basement. He began to shake as he neared the memories of the creature. He lit some candles and then did this chant thing and then the man with the shotgun appeared. The vigilante. Right sneered at the mention. Worse than a villain. Left agreed with a matching sneer, making them identical again. How? Izuku asked and he guessed that they blinked behind the sunglasses. How is being a vigilante worse than being a villain? Both defy the authority of the government. Right answer. But vigilantes think they have a better way. That they are in the right. Left growled. There is no way other than the government's way. Right continued, breaking the pattern of them only speaking once. But villains only want to hurt people. He was about to say help people until the memory of the man that had saved him pointing his shotgun at his head came roaring up. Continue with your story, Mr. Midoriya. Left said. After the man with the shotgun showed up he killed the man that had kidnapped me. Then he told me to be quiet and he disappeared. He looked for any kind of surprise on their faces or questions, but they merely stared at him from behind their sunglasses. After he did that the shaking was back now. Something came out of the hole in the basement wall. It was a worm-like thing with no eyes or nose and a mouth that never closed and had arms coming out of it. As soon as he began describing the creature it all came tumbling out of his mouth. Yes, a small deep tunneler. Right nodded with a smile. As expected. Left agreed, smiling as well. The what? Izuku asked. A deep tunneler. That's what it's called. Did they also say that it was a small one? It never got its body all the way out of the hole. Yes. Right answer. But more importantly, did it tell you anything? Left asked, leaning forward with Right. Did it mean? Izuku asked, confused. Did it speak? Right asked slowly, his smile gone. Left's smile was gone as well. No. Izuku answered honestly, confused at how such a creature could even do something like that. Good. We're done then. Left said as he stood up and Right closed his briefcase to follow him. What Izuku asked as he also stood up from his seat. That's it. But what about the fight after it appeared and the man threatening me and when the dark fighter showed up? We don't care. Right answered as he stopped at the door out of the room to look at him. The vigilante is being taken care of as we speak and the hero has been reassigned. Left continued. Reassigned? Izuku asked, confused. For doing such a good job saving you. Right soothed or at least attempted to. He's been given a recommendation to a better hero agency. Left confirmed. But before we go, Mr. Midoriya. The two men lowered their sunglasses as one, and Izuku's breath hitched as he saw what they had been hiding. Where their eyeballs should have been were miniature balls of light, like tiny suns. They spun around inside of the fleshy eye sockets, giving off faint yellow light. But every now and then they would turn sickly green for a brief moment. It would be a good idea to not speak about what occurred this morning, outside of the basic details of you being captured and rescued. Right said with a grin that showed perfect square teeth. Yes, the details could be dangerous to your mental and physical health. Left continued with a matching grin. My physical health. Izuku thought as he began to shake, turning over the implication in his mind. Are they going to have me killed? Only if you talk a bit too much. Right answered, and Izuku screamed and fell back, missing his seat and crashing to the floor. We apologize for startling you, Mr. Midoriya. Left said as he raised his sunglasses over his eyes, and Right did the same. Our quirks can be quite frightening, we know. They both then turned and exited the interrogation room, leaving Izuku on the floor shaking and his mind reeling. Oh god. Oh god. He breathed. What is going on? Izuku. His mother cried when he stepped into the lobby of the police station where she was waiting. She rushed and nearly crashed into him when she ran to hug him and confirm that he was safe. He wrapped his arms around her as she cried happily into his chest. The police had let him go easily enough, and soon they were on their way home, his mother trying her best to cheer him up with plans to cook his favorite food for lunch and dinner, and he didn't have to go back to school until he was ready. Izuku did his best to try and reassure his mother that he was alright, never daring to go into detail about what happened, and his mother didn't ask. Not even about the purple stains on his clothes from the creature's blood. On the trip back, Izuku looked at every person that passed and gazed into every storm drain he saw, fearing that something may be gazing back. He periodically looked over his shoulder to see if they were being followed by a man in black suit and tie with sunglasses. Or maybe the man with the shotgun who had somehow escaped. Or most illogically and terrifying, the creature would be right behind, alive, and ready to swallow him whole on the street. But nothing like that happened, and they returned home to find everything in order, his room exactly as he left it. The police had not found any of his possessions in the man's house, so they assumed that his backpack and the hero analysis for the future number 13 journal were gone. His mother promised to buy him all new supplies. So well, his mother made lunch and went through a round of phone calls to confirm to everybody that he was home safe and sound. Izuku stayed in his room. He laid on his bed in a new change of clothes and stared at the posters of All Might, his collection of action figures, and his hero analysis for the future journals. It all seemed so distant now. Like he had stumbled upon something more real than anything else in his life. Heroes couldn't compare to the sight of a deep tunneler dragged its way out of the earth to apparently feed and grant powers to the quirkless like the man that had kidnapped him. Or the threats of two feds who made it clear that if talked about what he had seen he'd be taken care of. Nothing he could ever do would make him forget that. He tried to start a new journal, beginning with an honorary entry on Dark Fighter and going off of the moves he had briefly seen before he gave up. As he played the fight between the hero and vigilante over in his mind, a thought occurred to him. Why didn't the man with the shotgun disappear when he fought Dark Fighter? He vanished so easily when fighting the deep tunneler. Izuku wondered as he replayed the two fights over in his mind. Against the monster the vigilante had been dominating, killing it with sneak attacks and only getting hit and pinned once. But when Dark Fighter showed up he never had a chance and was immobilized in seconds. What were the words that he said each time that he disappeared? Could they be a way to activate his quirk? Izuku tried to say, and the air began to still. His skin crawled for just a moment when he spat the word. Across the universe something heard him speak and turned its gaze to him. As soon as he finished speaking the last word, Izuku Midoriya vanished in the blink of an eye, leaving his room empty save for the imprint of his body on the bed. Izuku didn't notice the differences at first. As soon as he finished speaking the word hunt his stomach was in knots and he felt like the breath had been knocked out of him. He sat up and clutched his stomach, trying to soothe the pain away as he gasped for breath. What was that? He wheezed as he got off of his bed and stood up, still clutching his stomach. He walked around for a minute until the discomfort subsided and then settled back on his bed. Where did that come from? He thought as he tried to go over what could have caused it. It wasn't hunger pains, although he hadn't eaten in nearly a day, and that wouldn't explain the breath getting knocked out of him. Was it because I spoke? He turned the odd idea over in his head. I've been talking ever since I got rescued. It was then that he noticed the first difference. He had left his curtains open when he left for school yesterday, and they remained open now. Izuku glanced out the window for a split second before he went back to trying to figure out what had happened. Then he nearly broke his neck, snapping his attention back to the window to confirm what he saw. Rushing to the window he looked up at the sky and his heart almost stopped as his jaw dropped. The previously partly cloudy day had been replaced with a clear light green sky. Izuku backed away from his window slowly and then rushed out of his room through the open door and down the stairs. He ran into the kitchen where his mother was still preparing lunch and he nearly crashed into her as he skidded to a halt to look out the window behind the sink. The sky was clear and green outside of this window as well. "Mom. Do you see this?" he shouted as he tried to angle his head to see more of the strange sky. "What's going?" His mother had given no notice of his arrival, continuing to chop up vegetables to the side of the sink. "Mom." Izuku cried out as he placed his hand on her shoulder and tried to shake it to get her attention. He could not budge her. "Mom?" he whispered as he tried to shake her harder, waving a hand in her face to try and get her attention. Nothing worked. She continued to chop vegetables and work with no sign she knew her son was there. "No, no, no, no," he began to repeat as he paced the kitchen. He tried to pick up a wooden spoon off the counter. It felt like it weighed 10 tons and he could not even wiggle it from its place. Oh God. What's happening? As he rushed through their house trying to find something to interact with, he noticed the next two differences. The first was that, as he passed by a mirror in the hallway, he saw that he had no reflection. The glass simply showed the empty hall. The second was that there were no shadows. In his panic, he had not noticed that every room he went into was the same brightness, no matter if the lights were on or not, as the outside. I got to fix this." Izuku panicked as he walked back and forth behind his mother, still oblivious to what was troubling her son. "What did I do? What happened? I believe that I can explain." A deep voice in their living room called out and Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin. Sweating from running around the house already, he crept into the living room before stopping dead in his tracks. Sitting on the couch was a man with grayish-blue skin who wore what looked like animal leathers, from what he had no idea, like he was some kind of caveman. The man's legs were incredibly long, around 5 feet before they disappeared under the loincloth around his waist and did not end in feet but dull stumps. His arms were normal, but his hands and fingers were twice as long and each finger had 6 joints. Under the animal leathers he wore over his chest, Izuku could see a great scar down the middle that looked red and fresh. But the man's head, it looked like that if he had no deformities, then he would be quite plain looking, like a man in his mid-30s. From the nose up anyway. He had no mouth or chin, and there was just empty space under his nose that curved down into his neck. He had no hair on his head or face, lacking any body hair now that Izuku noticed, and had a single right eye that was orange in color. Izuku assumed that if the man had a left eye, it was under the massive growth that covered nearly 40% of his face, starting from the left cheek and working up. The growth was large and round, as if someone had placed a balloon under his skin and inflated it. There were veins stretched in across it that pulsed with life, and most bizarrely it changed color. The flesh of the growth was a cool light blue that shifted to a deeper blue or even purple before going back again. "Am I dreaming?" Izuku whispered as he stared at the man sitting on his couch, relaxed as could be. "That's a question you should have asked a long time ago." "And no." The man answered with no mouth to speak with as he gestured to an empty spot on the couch. "Sit, child, we must talk." With feet like lead, Izuku walked over to the couch and shook as he sat down next to the strange man. "Do not tremble, child, I'm not here to hurt you." Who are you?" Izuku asked as he tried to look at him only to turn away when he saw the single orange eye. "I am an avatar, the personification of the will of a god." Avatar answered plainly and placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder, who flinched when he did so. "Specifically, the one who currently has a stake in your soul." "What?" Izuku shouted in a blind panic. "What do you mean they have a stake in my soul? How?" "You spoke an incantation, child, saying the correct words to draw forth power to shift reality to your will." Avatar started to explain calmly. "It was my creator's power that you drew from, and, as such, they have deemed your soul there upon your death. You have a debt to pay now, child." "What are you talking about?" Izuku cried as he bolted off the couch he had just sat down on to stare down at Avatar. With a lot of effort to avoid his single eye, of course. "I never said any incanta." He stopped his argument mid-word when he remembered the 3 words he had spoken before all of this had started. He said and waited for everything to return to normal. He waited for Avatar to disappear, the shadows, and his reflection to return, and to be able to pick up or move things again. Nothing changed. Yes, those were the words. "An incantation to bring the caster to this base," Avatar said as he looked at the dejected Izuku. "A very common incantation if I'm at all honest. I didn't mean to." Izuku tried to bargain. "It was an accident. I didn't know that this would happen." "Did you not observe a man use this incantation twice, child?" Avatar pointed out. "I didn't know that it would do this. I thought it was part of his quirk or something." Izuku shouted back. "The quirk?" Avatar asked, confused before his growth turned a pale yellow for a moment before returning to light blue. "Ah, a mark of Jiroshul. Of course." Before Izuku could ask what the name he called quirks by means, Avatar stood up. "Follow me, child." Given his height, with legs 5 feet long and a torso that was a bit long putting him at 10 feet, Izuku expected Avatar to smash his head into the ceiling. Instead, the strange man passed through it and stood at his full height, walking forward as if it were nothing. Intangibility? Izuku wondered as Avatar walked through the wall and outside, leaving him alone in the living room. After a moment he followed after him, going to the front door. Here he encountered the problem that he could not even turn the doorknob as it felt like it weighed as much as the house. "Relax and just walk forward, child," Avatar said as he suddenly appeared above Izuku, leaning forward and passing through the doorway. "It is the tensing of muscles and the passing of thoughts that keep you solid." With that he disappeared again, leaving a trembling Izuku who had nearly had a heart attack when he appeared out of nowhere. Looking forward at the door, Izuku raised a hand and placed it on the solid wood. Breathing deeply, he tried to calm himself and began to press his hand into the door. "This is crazy," he whispered as nothing happened at first. But as he kept breathing and he was left alone to calm down, Avatar was content to wait for him. Izuku started to notice that his balance was inching forward. With a startled gasp that destroyed all his meager calm, he found his hand embedded halfway up the fingers. "Oh god, this works. This works." He felt no pain or discomfort from this, the only sensation was that his hand was stuck and he felt wood when he tried to move it. Resuming his breathing, he slowly progressed through the front door. First he got his entire hand into the door itself, then his wrist, and then he felt his hand reach the other side. By the time his mother walked into the living room and turned the television on, he was up to his elbow. For some terrifying moments he wondered how he was going to breathe when his mouth and nose were inside the door. This was how he discovered the next difference in the space, as Avatar had called it. He did not need to breathe. All his calming breaths did nothing, as when he tested how long he could hold his breath to try and push his head through the door at that time, he noticed that his lungs did not start to burn. The wind getting knocked out of him when he first cast the incantation had been the only time he had been out of breath, even with his shouting. So with his eyes closed shut, Izuku eventually managed to push himself through the front door and step out into his front yard. And it only took him 10 minutes to do so. "That took you a while," Avatar said, standing on the sidewalk looking as odd as he did sitting on the couch. Izuku ignored him and continued to look back at the front door of his house, his jaw trembling and eyes wide. "I did it," he whispered to himself. "I walked through solid matter. Like I had an intangibility quirk," he shouted, a wide smile breaking out across his face. "This is amazing. This is incredible." His elation was cut short as he turned to look at Avatar, and his gaze swept up to the light green sky, where for the first time he could stare straight up. How? Directly above him was a planet with 3 orbiting moons. It had pale purple landmasses and red oceans with yellow ice caps. Behind it was a green planet that looked like it had been cracked open, its molten core exposed to the great green void all around. Behind that was a red gas giant that made the other planet seem so small, with a dozen moons orbiting around it. And on, and on. And on into eternity, a line of planets twisting and turning into light green nothingness. "Where?" Izuku gasped, even though he didn't need to. "Where am I?" "This, child, is the between," Avatar answered as he gestured to Izuku to join him on the sidewalk. "Where all worlds in the universe are joined. All that bear some form of life, that is." "How is this possible?" Izuku asked, stunned beyond belief. He had been wrong. For a brief moment he forgot all about the deep tunneler, the man with the shotgun who had tried to kill him, and the Fed's eyes and warning. Despite the impossibility of what he was seeing, this felt more real than any of that. Instantly, he was aware that he was crying. And he has no idea why. "I do not know, child," Avatar answers as Izuku joins him, rubbing his eyes clear. "I was created merely to interact with those who draw upon my creator's power." They stand there a moment, Izuku continuing to look up at the example of the living cosmos before him until Avatar breaks the silence. "It occurs to me that given the current state of your species that you would not properly recognize magic. No doubt many of your kind have written off magic, other species, and unknown phenomena as quirks, as you call them," Avatar explained in a long-winded fashion. "Impressive with no mouth or even a jaw. Therefore, I will be leaving you until you knowingly complete a full incantation or ritual." "Really? Thanks." Izuku starts to say before a thought occurs to him that stops him cold. "How do I get out of here?" Avatar merely turns from him and disappears into thin air, leaving him standing alone. Izuku stands there for a second before he starts to look around and panic. His street seemed to be normal, he can even see some of his neighbors going about their daily business, but he already knows that there is no way to interact with anything. And passing through objects is a slow endeavor, so he was essentially stuck outside unless he could find an open door. "Until I knowingly complete a full incantation or ritual," Izuku repeated as he stared up at the long string of planets. He couldn't be sure, but he thought he recognized Pluto. I could use the one that brought me here, but then I'd be forfeiting my soul to whoever made that guy. And didn't I repeat it in the living room? Nothing happened then. He wondered. Wait, he said that was an incantation to bring the caster here. He never said anything about bringing them back. Izuku realized with a fright as he started to pace on the sidewalk. But if it did just bring me here, wouldn't that make it a full incantation? Then why didn't the time that said it in the living room count as knowingly doing it? I knew that it was magic by that point and that he wanted my soul. There was a skittering sound to his left. Stopping in his tracks, Izuku's head whipped towards the sound, not used to hearing it anywhere in his neighborhood. He was treated with an unusual sight. An iguana was sitting on a pillar connecting some fences around a front yard. A blue iguana. And it was staring right at him. Izuku stared right back at the strangely colored lizard, unsure of how he was supposed to react to it. There was a skittering sound behind him. He turned and saw a blue iguana behind him, staring at him from the sidewalk. There was a skittering sound to the right of him. He didn't bother to turn and see what was over there. He turned back to the original lizard and started to move in the one direction that he hadn't heard a lizard at before he got encircled. The lizards were not keen on that. The original opened its mouth and faster than Izuku could blink its tongue shot out like a frog's. However, where a frog's tongue was large and sticky on the end to catch prey, this lizard's extremely long tongue ended in a sharp yellow pincer. The strange appendage soared straight for his face, and Izuku cried out as it barely missed the center of his face, the open pincer easily cutting his cheek. "Run!" he screamed in his mind as he booked it down the street, rushing past a neighbor watering his bushes who had no idea he or the three lizards chasing him were there. Daring to look back, Izuku narrowly managed to move his head to avoid a pincer from impaling his face or ripping his nose off. "I gotta get out of here," he thought as he moved his hand to his cut cheek and felt the warm blood flowing out. "They're going to kill me." There was a stabbing pain around his right ankle, and with a cry Izuku collapsed onto the sidewalk. Looking back, he found a pincer tongue wrapped around his ankle, blood already beginning to pour from where it pierced his flesh. Following the tongue back to its lizard, he saw it begin digging into the sidewalk, passing through the concrete until only its tongue seemed to appear out of the ground. "They have intangibility," as well, Izuku screamed in his mind as the other two lizards rushed to him and passed their submerged counterparts. "And this is a snare," he realized as he looked at the pincer wrapped around his ankle. One lizard grabs the prey and then goes underground where it would be difficult to impossible to dislodge them, while the others finish off the trapped prey. "Oh god. Oh, fuck," Izuku cried as the two free lizards approached, hissing viciously, and he tried to pry the pincer off of the ankle. But his weak arms were unable to pry it open even a little, and soon the lizards were upon him. The first blue iguana leaped for his throat with a piercing cry, and he was only able to stop it by putting his left arm in the path of its open mouth. The lizard tore into his flesh with wild abandon, sending blood flying. Crying out in pain, Izuku didn't notice the second iguana that leaped onto his right wrist when he tried to raise a fist to beat the first off. Blood flowed freely from the punctured veins, and soon his clothes were as blood-stained as the concrete. "Oh god, please. Someone. Help me," he screamed as he looked around, the lizards tearing his arms apart. There was an old lady reading on her front porch. There was a man walking his dog. There was a family going past in a minivan. No one could hear his cries for help. No one could even see him. He was alone here. If he died, then no one would ever know. Just like with the deep tunneler. And no. Izuku screamed, not in pain, but in anger. He brought his left arm down hard on the ground, putting the lizard biting it against the concrete hard. The blue iguana let go for a brief moment, and that was all he needed. He moved his left hand as fast as he could to the iguana, chewing his right wrist, and grabbed its head, jamming his fingers into its eyes. Hopped up on anger and adrenaline, he managed to squeeze hard enough its eyes popped, covering his fingers in milky fluid. The lizard screeched in pain and let go of his wrist to skitter away, but before he could grab his bleeding wrist to stop the flow of blood, the iguana that was won his left arm renewed its attack. It latched onto his left arm again, and in return Izuku smashed down on the ground again and again. But the iguana snarling him stuck in the ground, he scooted towards it so the tongue got a little loose, and then with a lot of grit teeth and curses he twisted around until the remaining blue iguana was under him. Then, planting a free foot on its body, he pried it off his arm, sending a new shower of blood to soak the ground. Standing there, bleeding from his arms and ankles, Izuku looked down at the lizard trapped under his foot trying to claw to get away. His blood and flesh was on its teeth. He brought his foot up and then immediately down again, stomping the blue iguana. And then he did it again. And again. He did it until there was a satisfying crunch and it stopped moving, its pincer tongue falling out of its mouth. But the immediate danger out of the way, minus the pincer still wrapped around his ankle, Izuku began to feel the effects of his wounds and began to sway. Got to stop the blood loss, he thought as he struggled to take his shirt off. He clumsily wrapped it around his right wrist, the part that was bleeding the most, and then fell back onto the bloody sidewalk. He didn't really care that his hands were in a pool of his own blood or the dead iguana lying between them. I can't handle this. That was just 2 lizards. He thought, as he looked at the pincer still around his ankle, then the shirt wrapped around his wrist. It was quickly becoming drenched with blood. He could smell it so clearly. And there's no telling what else is here in this space. Izuku looked up at the string of planets above him stretching off into the abyss. Before it had inspired in him some sense of wonder, thinking about what fantastical things could be there. Now they are filled with dread and terror, thinking about what horrible things could be waiting there. That is a wisdom-speaking child. Avatar said, as he appeared beside him, bringing his stump foot down on the tongue holding him. It broke in half, as if it were nothing, and the iguana quickly climbed out of the ground and fled, leaving a trail of yellow blood behind. The incantation that brought me here, it's incomplete, isn't it? Izuku said, as his head swooned. I need the return words, I only heard one half of it, correct? Avatar said, as he kneeled next to him. Would you like the words, child? You have lost a lot of this fluid you need. Izuku closed his eyes and tried to take deep breaths that he tried to remind himself he didn't need here. If he accepted, then his soul would belong to whatever god had created Avatar, free to do with it what it wished when he died. But if he refused, then he would die here. There was no way around it. He doubted that blue iguanas were the top of the food chain around here. What do I have to do? Are there any conditions? He asked, pushing the amount of time he had with this much lost blood. Just one. Avatar said and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. My creator is an old god. And old gods only accept one tribute sacrifice. He let the words sink in as Izuku's vision swam more. It won't be much, not yet, not until you ask for more spells. Why would I do that? Izuku asked harshly. Nothing good has come of this one. Oh child, Avatar said, no one ever stops at just one. Would you like the words now? You haven't got much time. Yes. Izuku whispered and damned his soul. Very well, Avatar said, sounding incredibly pleased, his growth turning pink for a moment, laughing. Your sacrifice shall be a living creature a quarter your weight every season during a night with a first quarter moon. Slit its throat in a circle of lit candles. That is all. Avatar stood and looked down at Izuku, bleeding and pitiable. Failure will see the hounds unleashed upon you and all who you love. Goodbye, sorcerer. And with that, Avatar disappeared into thin air. Hey Slog. Izuku spoke to himself. And with that, Izuku disappeared into thin air. Izuku reappeared in his world in the same manner as when he disappeared from his bedroom. However, it was with a lot more fanfare. He was noticed almost immediately and people rushed to see what was wrong with him and calls for an ambulance were made. They sickened at the amount of blood and his wounds and wondered what had happened and how nobody had noticed. Izuku did not pay attention to them though, his attention was focused on one thing. The dead stomped on a blue iguana that had been laying near him. It had come with him. I can go there and back. He thought as people helped him into a sitting position away from all of the blood on the ground he had brought with him. But they can come with me. He realized looking at the lizard's dead body, people were already poking it and its strange tongue. They probably don't even need me to come over. He thought about how no one had seen him screaming as they ate him in their world. Had he done the same? Walked by someone being killed by a monster he could not see or hear. Can they pull people over to their side? He wondered as he heard sirens approach. If so, then there would be no way for those people to escape that world or others like it. They'd be completely alone and at the mercy of those monsters. There would be no one there to save them, no hero to swoop in and save the day. As he was being loaded onto a stretcher and his mother came out of the house to see what was going on and screamed his name when she saw him, he saw something in the crowd of onlookers. It was a boy, about 6, wearing an All Might t-shirt. Izuku saw the smiling face of his hero on that shirt and looked at the dead blue iguana being bagged up by a confused police officer. Between those two things and all the unaware and helpless people he saw his place. His future. Izuku was honestly astonished that his trip to the hospital and interview with the police went so well. The entire time that he spent there, either in bed resting or being treated by doctors, he expected for the 2 federal agents with the stars for eyes or some random man with a gun to come and kill him. It made him a rather nervous wreck when he wasn't on the painkillers. But that had paled in comparison to when the police told him that they had come to the conclusion that the blue iguana that had attacked him and unknown to them accidentally brought over from the between was smuggled to Japan. It turned out that there was an endangered species of blue iguanas from the island of Grand Cayman and the police deduced that a tourist had found one bearing a quirk, the elongated tongue and pincer at the end of it, and brought it back. Then after finding the animal too much to handle they had dumped it in the streets where it had somehow attacked him with no one noticing. They were still curious about that last part, especially with the amount of injuries he had, meaning that the fight would have to have gone on for quite a while. Izuku, seeing how golden of an opportunity this was to cover what he was doing, just played along and said that he had been so shocked and afraid at the lizard's attacks, he hardly made as much sound as it happened. Luckily he had managed to keep his composure for the entire interview, and it was only after he was sure they were long gone did he start to laugh madly. He laughed at the sheer luck and absurdity of the police, drawing a conclusion that seemed quite fantastical on its own, but when compared to the truth seemed mundane. He had started laughing so hard, the stress and fear of the unbelievably mad and horrible day flowing out with it and making him want to never stop laughing, that his mother nearly called a doctor. She was worried that her son was going mad after the day he had. Maybe, she's right. Izuku thought as he looked up at the ceiling of his hospital room. The room was dark and the clock next to his bed showed that it was past midnight, and yet he dared not go to sleep. He was afraid of what dreams he would have if today was real. I woke up from being kidnapped, was almost eaten by a deep tunneler, nearly executed by my rescuer, threatened into silence by 2 government agents with suns for eyes, cast a spell that took me to the between, met the avatar of a god, was nearly killed by a bunch of monster lizards, and sold my soul to some god so I could just go home. He listened off in his head, too tired and paranoid to mutter out loud, as he was wont to do. Most people would go crazy. And he certainly felt like he was growing crazy, the reality of what he had learned about the world, so out there it boggles the mind. Monsters were real, and they were underground, invisible, and probably in a host of other places. Magic was real, and all it took was saying some words and selling your soul to some god. Gods were real, and they demanded blood and sacrifice for their blessing to use their power. Aliens were real, and there were so many planets populated that they stretched into the abyss of the between. Other worlds were real and existed on top of or mixed in with ours, invisible, but there. And there seemed to be a government conspiracy to keep all of it hushed up and secret, willing to kill witnesses if they talked. And it seemed some regular people, like the man with the shotgun who had saved him from the deep tunneler, were fighting against it with the same goal in mind. Although they seemed to kill anybody who saw anything, let alone talked about it. All of these things weighed heavily on his mind, but they were pushed to the back, and in the front was a familiar subject. Superheroes. There weren't that many he could think of that had invisibility or intangibility quirks, mostly because those two were better suited for infiltration heroes. They were perfect for observing and collecting information about criminals and villain organizations without raising suspicion. Many of them only got their names in the news when a big raid on such an organization occurred, and then it was usually only to answer questions while the police took the bad guys away. Nothing big and flashy like the combat heroes that fought villains in the streets on live television. Even rescue heroes were more popular as they garnered much public love during disasters, working hard to pull people out of dangerous situations. Infiltration heroes did the work that was long and unappreciated by the general public and almost never went above being B-listers. It was perfect. He had eyes watching him, waiting for him to slip up and speak about what he had seen, so the spotlight is definitely not where he wanted to be. He had worried that the 2 government agents would realize that he had learned a magic incantation and have him dealt. But all they had said was that he couldn't talk about what he'd seen, and they hadn't shown any surprise when he said that the man with the shotgun had disappeared. So did they know he used a spell or think he had a quirk? If they could read minds like he feared, then they'd know that he knew the words that would become the first half of the incantation sending him to and back from the between. Did they not care what he did, as long as he didn't talk? Keeping all of this secret seemed to be their only concern, except for vigilantes like the man with the shotgun. Speaking of, Izuku replayed the fight of the man versus the deep tunneler in his mind for perhaps the 1000th time. With the new knowledge about the incantation that brings you to the between and the basic rules of that space, a lot of things were clear. The man had used it primarily for stealth, becoming effectively invisible to the real world as he had to his mom and people outside. And given that you couldn't interact with anything you didn't bring with you like your clothes, he had to come back into the real world to be able to sneak attack the deep tunneler with his shotgun. Taking a guess, Izuku theorized that if he used it in the between, the shots would have done nothing. They'd have stopped dead against the monster's pale white and slimy skin. But more importantly, the man had used the incantation to escape the crushing grasp of the monster. When he had been pinned to the floor by the creature, he had said the words and disappeared, but the monster's hands had continued to press down on air for a few seconds before slamming into the concrete. This raised 2 questions in Izuku's mind. The first was, how could the creature still seemingly interact with the man after he went to the between? While he guessed that the real world could still affect stuff in the between at that point, the deep tunneler should have felt just air against its palms. Nothing he did to get his mom's attention had worked when he went over, and he had tried to shake her pretty hard only for her to not budge. But the monster didn't show confusion until the hands hit the concrete and it realized that the man was gone. Could people in the between still be felt by those who touched them when they went over? But if the caster's clothes and what they were holding came with them, then why did the deep tunneler not go with the man? did they only bring what they wanted? More and more questions for later. The second was, how did the man pass through the monster's hand so quickly? It took Izuku 10 minutes to get through his front door that was only about 1.5 inches thick. The creature's hands were a similar thickness if remembered correctly, and the man had only needed a few seconds to pass through. Did this mean that the speed you could become intangible and pass through objects in the between could be decreased with experience? He hoped so, because he was going to need to be a lot faster than 10 minutes. I have power now, Izuku thought, his left fist clenching since the wrist on his right arm was still tender and stitched up. I need to learn how it works, I need to get better at it, and I need to learn how to manage the dangers, he thought as he remembered the blue iguanas. I was saved by a hero this morning, but that was only because the man with the shotgun was making a lot of noise. Izuku remembered the hero's explanation of how he heard about the crime. This afternoon no one saved me, I had to sell my soul to be able to save myself. He had a power now, and it had cost him dearly. The sacrifice every season on the night of the first quarter moon, he would have to kill an animal at least a quarter of his weight in a ring of candles. Already his stomach churned at the thought of it. But he feared the hounds threatened to be unleashed on him and his family more. Many heroes had quirks that were destructive to themselves or those around them. All Might's strength could have made him the most powerful and dangerous villain in existence. But instead he used it to do good, with the occasional bit of property damage, but that was expected from all heroes. Unless he accidentally brought someone in with him or something out of the between, as he had done with the blue iguana corpse, then the only danger the incantation posed was to himself. That, and the risk of someone repeating the words he said to cast the spell, and bring themselves to the between accidentally like he had done. Then they'd be doomed to be eaten or damn their souls just to get out. Maybe I'll get a mask that hides my voice, Izuku mused as he began to drift off to sleep. It would fit the sneaky infiltration hero thing. As he drifted off, Izuku smiled for the first time that day. He had decided, realizing the idea that had come to him as he had been taken away in an ambulance and seen the child's All Might shirt and the police taking the dead iguana away. He would be a hero. He would protect them from not only villains and criminals but from the monsters that they couldn't even see but could most definitely see them. He would fight the monsters that hurt people where he found them, be it dark basements or in their own world. He would save people from being killed by whoever these vigilantes were. He would save them from being murdered just for seeing something that had left them terrified and confused, doing his best to ensure that they wouldn't need to be threatened into silence like the government agents seemed to do. The terrified unfortunates would not find themselves staring down the barrel of a gun from their supposed savior, but instead see a smile, even in the face of unimaginable terror and horror. A smile that would let them know that they were saved. And if these heroics got him labeled a vigilante by the government agents because he didn't do things their way. But before he could complete that wondering, he drifted off completely, sleeping soundly with a smile despite the horrible day that he had had. And across the universe, a god listened in and laughed cruelly. Tuesday, April 13th, 2128, 300 days until UA entrance exam. Izuku's training to master his new incantation would have to wait until his mother was willing to let him out of her sight. After first nearly losing him to a kidnapping and then him disappearing from their own home only to find him outside and bleeding, she was understandably terrified to let him go too far. So he put off trying anything with the incantation for a few days, instead spending them lounging around their home trying to enjoy his old hobbies. But even as he idly browsed hero news and reread his old comics, his mind turned anxiously to the plans he had and questions he wanted answered. He looked over his old hero analysis for the future journals, scouring them for ideas for tactics that involved invisibility, intangibility, and hero work in general. Finally, after a few days cooped up at home with his mother, she had to go to the grocery store and he was presented with the opportunity to be alone if only for a short while. So with reassurances to his mother that he would be fine for the time she'd be gone, he waited until he lost sight of her from the window he was peeking out of. Once she was gone, he got started on his first test. Going up to his room, Izuku set out 4 objects on his bed, a couple comic books, an almighty action figure, and a hand mirror taken from his mother's room. "Kak," he said for the first time in days, and was this time not struck by the wind getting knocked out of him and his stomach hurting. Thankfully that seemed to be a one-time thing. Confirming that he was in the between by trying and failing to pick any of the objects up after checking his room for any blue iguanas, Izuku immediately left the between with a laugh. Then he confirmed he was back by picking up each object and checking outside that the sky was blue and didn't have a long line of alien planets. After confirming that he could get in and out easily, Izuku began his test. Grabbing one of the comic books, he went into the between, the comic firmly grasped in his hands. Inside the between he was able to lift it and toss it around like it was nothing, and a check with the mirror lying on the bed showed that it was as invisible as he and his clothes were. Laying the comic book down on the bed where he had picked it up, Izuku then left the between. In the real world there was no comic book lying where he had left it. He placed his hand down on the bed next to where it was supposed to be and moved his hand across where it should be. He felt nothing, but when he went back into the between he found the comic book moved as if it had been pushed across the bed. So I can leave things in the between, but they still get influenced by objects in the real world. Izuku noted as he went to his desk and made a note in a new journal. This one he wouldn't title and would need a proper hiding place for, maybe here in his room in the between. I'll have to be careful where I place hidden items in the between. It'll have to be easy to get to without being in a place where it'll get moved unknowingly. Next, after returning to the between to grab the comic he had left behind, he picked up the almighty action figure and looked at it intently, really focusing on the smiling face of his hero. I don't want to bring you. Izuku thought intently as he prepared to enter the between. With all his thoughts on the action figure not coming with him, Izuku entered the between and moved the action figure over the mirror on the bed. The action figure was seemingly flying in midair. Ah ha ha. Izuku laughed out loud as he swung All Might around in the air, the action figure's reflection showing it twisting and turning with his invisible movements. After he was done making the plastic version of his hero fly around, he set the toy down on his bed and after confirming that he couldn't pick up any of the comic books or the mirror, he tried to pick up the action figure. It weighed about as much as it did in the real world and once again in the mirror it was seemingly flying on its own. So I can only affect objects in the real world that I'm touching when I go into the between, but don't want to bring with me. And they behave normally, they don't feel impossibly heavy. He noted in the journal when he came out of the between, a smile on his face. This spell was alright when he wasn't being nearly eaten alive by the monsters that lived in the space it took him. I wonder how many things I can leave behind. He thought as he looked down at his clothes. Focusing on all his clothes, his shirt, shorts, underwear and socks, Izuku once again entered the between holding the mirror out in front of him, also focusing on not bringing it so he could move it around to look at himself. Initially disappointed to find no floating clothes in the mirror's reflection, he tilted it up and down and found that he had partially succeeded. His right sock was planted on the ground, filled by an invisible foot. Well, it's a start. He said as he came back from the between. He made a special note in his journal after he set the mirror back down on his bed. Clothes test number 11 sock, right. Now I've got something to try and track my progress with. Izuku said as he readied for the final test that he had planned. Taking an eraser off his desk he went into the between and laid it down on his desk. Coming out of the between he raised his left hand above where the eraser was in the between and then brought it down onto the desk with a loud slap. He felt nothing, but then again he hadn't expected to after the comic book test and he raised his hand and found nothing out of the ordinary with it. Going into the between he found the eraser crushed into a fine pink dust that had spread out from the impact point, desperately trying to place the matter anywhere that wasn't between two impossible to move or stop objects. Note to self, do not let something fall on me. Izuku whispered as he looked at the pink dust, imagining that he'd look much the same if something as simple as a blanket or towel was unknowingly thrown over where he was standing in the between. He shuddered as he imagined watching the blanket slowly descend, forcing him down with its impossible weight until he fell to the ground. But it wouldn't stop there, it would continue falling until it laid flat on the ground, crushing his bones and flesh into a fine mix of red paste that shot out from under the blanket to try and reach any open space. And that wasn't the only threat, what if it rained? Each drop would punch through him like a bullet, tearing him apart slowly or quickly, depending on how hard it was raining. Hell, even if a leaf landed on him that would be it. I have to master intangibility. Fast. Izuku whispered in his safe empty room, his body shaking in fear when he looked out his window at the outside world. He had been so unbelievably lucky that the first time he went into the between it had been the lizards that had nearly killed him, and not one of the people who couldn't see him or even the weather. Thursday, April 15, 2128, 298 days until UA entrance exam. Izuku needed something to train his intangibility on that wouldn't leave him exposed for 10 minutes like the front door. He didn't know if he had gotten lucky or Avatar had kept them away and then let them attack him when he left, but Izuku didn't want to be trapped inside of anything if the blue iguanas came across him. The image of being half and half through a door and his exposed body parts being feasted on by the lizards as he could do nothing wasn't pleasant. So he needed something thin and large enough for him to walk most of his body through, as he wasn't going to trust crawling while intangible quite yet. He wasn't sure what kept him from falling through the floor or solid ground the first time he did it, or how the blue iguana that had caught him with its pincer tongue had dug itself into the ground. Those were questions and tests for another time. But Izuku had found the perfect thing to start practicing his intangibility on, and, as long as his mom wasn't home or asleep, as she was now, it would be easy to set up and hide. He smoothed the tape above his door that was holding the hanging bath towel in front of the open doorway to his room. Stepping down from the stool, Izuku eyed the hanging piece of cloth. At only a quarter of an inch thick, it was 6 times thinner than their front door, but he knew he would have to check later to see if material affected his ability to pass through objects. Izuku had also discovered that the between not only had no shadows, but that the amount of light never changed, regardless of the time of day. So when he went into the between with his cell phone in his hands, which to no great surprise had no signal there, showing him that it was past midnight, the dark house suddenly lit up like it was high noon. While he waited for his eyes to adjust to the light, which was going to be a pain to deal with while heroin at night he could already tell, Izuku reached out and tried to push the towel. Like everything else, it would not budge, becoming effectively a very thin and fuzzy wall. Okay, first I have to check the hall, he said to himself, a little nervous, as he ducked under the towel to poke his head into the hallway. Looking left and right, he found no lizards waiting for him and sighed in relief. Alright, he said, as he crawled backwards into his room and stood, here goes. Pressing the stopwatch on his phone on, Izuku set it aside as it started counting the seconds. Breathing deeply, which he still didn't need to do in the between, but it helped him relax, he began to walk forward into the hanging towel. Slowly, ever so slowly, he pushed his way through it. He closed his eyes when they went through, not ready to test what would happen if he kept them open as he passed through an object. By the time that he had gotten through the towel, stood in the hallway for a moment to confirm that he was there, and then crawled under the towel, while doing his best to be tangible, Izuku found his phone at 1 minute and 54 seconds. 6 times thinner and just under 6 times faster. He thought, as he left the between to make note of the time, waiting for his eyes to readjust to the darkness of the real world. Clothes test number 2 1 sock, right. Clothes test number 3 1 sock, left. Clothes test number 4 underwear. Progress. Owl test number 1 154. Let's try to get that number down some before I go to bed, he thought with a smile as he picked up his phone and re-entered the between. He blinked the brightness of the between away and froze at what he saw. There was a blue iguana's head coming out of the hallway floor, looking around curiously as Izuku stood behind it. Izuku stood frozen as he watched the lizard scan the hallway, head and the tips of its 4 legs poking out of the floor. Distantly, he tried to figure out how the lizard had done this and realized that it must have been downstairs and then either hearing, smelling, or maybe even detecting him climbed up the wall that was directly under this hallway. Or maybe it climbed up through the inside of the wall. Before the lizard could get around to looking behind itself, Izuku left the between and after adjusting to the darkness, found no blue iguana's head in his hallway. Maybe once is enough for tonight, Izuku muttered to himself as he got the stool and began to remove the towel hanging in his doorway. Monday, April 26, 2128, 287 days until UA entrance exam. It took over a week for Izuku's mother to let him out of the house and a few more days after that to let him go by himself. But his time in the outside world was welcome after spending a week inside their home, even if he did pass the time theorizing, testing the between, and coming up with designs for his future hero costume and what he'd need to use his incantation effectively and safely. But for now he was enjoying the peace of a local park, one large enough to have a playground and a small pond. There were people all around, some relaxing on benches or watching their children play, but they didn't hold Izuku's attention as much as the giant flying jellyfish did. Izuku watched from the between as a herd of 8 big red jellyfish, each the size of a van he estimated, floated gently through the sky. Their long arms dangled in the air and passed through every solid object in their path. Even the bodies of the jellyfish passed through tall buildings as they floated along, sometimes disappearing entirely inside before re-emerging. Izuku knew the people inside couldn't feel the giant monsters literally going through them, but the image still made him shudder. Looking around, Izuku noticed that there were some blue iguanas getting near the pond's edge and looking towards him. Sighing, he turned from them and began to walk from the pond center and back towards land. He had found out that he really couldn't affect anything in the real world from the between, which included water. It was as solid to him as the ground was. That didn't mean it was easy to walk on, of course, the water was constantly shifting slightly, so he had to fight to keep balance. It didn't help that there were some kids throwing rocks into water and laughing at the ripples they made. The ripples that kept almost tripping him up as he made his way to dry land. Once he was there, he looked back at the pond and saw the blue iguanas slowly walking across it towards him. They didn't seem to have it easy when walking on water either. Not wanting to let them catch up, Izuku walked to a public restroom and after checking that all of the stalls in the men's room were empty and he was alone, he left the between. Stepping out of the restroom, he found no blue iguanas, no flying red jellyfish, and no light green sky with a long line of planets. Smiling, he walked back towards the pond and, kneeling down, he flicked the water with his hand, confirming that it behaved the way it should. I think I got the hang of the basics of this, Izuku thought as he stood. I just need to get better at it and learn how to read the lizards better. and figure out how the jellyfish behaved too. He thought as he walked off, his ease noticeable in the way he moved. If things keep progressing this well, I'll be ready for the UA entrance exam in no time. Maybe I should add a physical fitness portion to my training. He mused as he left the park. But unbeknownst to him, back in the between, a man-shaped creature now stood at the center of the pond where Izuku had been not a minute before. The creature stood 14 feet tall and had skin like red leather with the occasional ridge or spike coming out of the skin. It had no facial features and its head was a perfect oval on a square neck that nonetheless followed Izuku's movements. Its arms reached all the way down to its ankles and did not end in hands, but a tube-like opening. Its legs were thick and strong and ended with clawed prehensile feet like an ape's, but with a thumb on both sides. The between man silently watched Izuku Midoriya walk out of the park and continue on his way home before beginning to follow him. The between man's long strides and swaying arms went unnoticed by everyone as it stepped over and occasionally through them. It had only one focus, one target, and that was Izuku Midoriya. Thanks for watching my video and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description. See you next time, till then sayonara.